How have we reached this outcome? While attention is fixed exclusively on the Soviet Union and the Third Reich, we will see Gandhi equate British imperialism and Nazi imperialism in his denunciation of colonial Britain and Nazi Germany. Researchers beyond suspicion of anti-Western bias have on repeated occasions compared the treatment of the colonial peoples, carried out but also justified by the liberal West, to the genocidal practices of the Third Reich. This comparison is made in relation to the deportation of the Cherokees ordered by Andrew Jackson, the attitude assumed by Theodore Roosevelt regarding the inferior races, the treatment by England inflicted on the Irish people. There's more. The key words in our time used to describe the horrors of the 20th century emerge from the studies done of the liberal world of the 19th century. In specific reference to the development of industrial capitalism in England, it's been stated that the Gulag is not an invention of the 20th century. Defined as a totalitarian society is that which in Australia devours those deported from England. Finally, in regard to the tragedy of the indigenous peoples in America, Australia or in British colonies in general, authoritative researchers in turn spoke of an American Holocaust, of an Australian Holocaust and of a late Victorian Holocaust, not to mention the Black Holocaust, to which African Americans seek to call attention, and finally the Canadian Holocaust that we've already come across. Even in regard to the events that have taken place under our watch, in authoritative news organizations we can read that in Afghanistan, an American protectorate, the captured Taliban members are put in a place that resembles the Nazi concentration camp of Auschwitz and that in Guantanamo there is, according to the words of Amnesty International, a kind of gulag in our times. Finally, it's worthwhile to observe that a more impartial American historiography didn't hesitate in making a comparison between the Anglo-American annihilation by air of entire cities, Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, on the one hand, and the genocide of Jews on the other. 550 But all of this magically disappears in the ruling ideology and historiography, just as it disappears the reality of the concentrationary universe that during the second 30 Years' War arises even in the countries of a more consolidated liberal tradition, and that these countries, even after the defeat of the Third Reich, continue to operate for some time with anti-Soviet and anti-communist purposes, and that, at any rate, are expanded in the colonies or semi-colonies. However colossal it may be, that omission isn't enough to construct the myth of the twin monsters. Working from the comparison of the USSR and the Third Reich, they introduce the comparison of Stalin and Hitler, removing both from their respective historical contexts and political projects. Once the explosive contradictions that characterize them are removed, the Second Time of Troubles on the one hand, and the Second 30 Years' War on the other, the Stalinian terror appears as the expression of a gratuitous violence, motivated exclusively by totalitarian ideology, or directly motivated by the bloody paranoia of a single person. Similarly suppressed is Hitler's historical contextualization. He was born at the end of the 19th century. The most painful century in human history has not yet ended, the century of colonization, and above all else the century of races, which had the merit of having refuted once and for all the naive ideas of universal brotherhood from the 18th century and the mythology of the common origin and unity of mankind, the ideological tool that the socialists pathetically cling to, despite their explicit rejection by history and science. 551 In 1898, it's the Anglo-German author Houston S. Chamberlain who expresses that view, and he will later become particularly admired by Hitler, but at that time he's acclaimed across the West. That is to say that, to comprehend Nazism it's necessary to first study the political project that's at its roots, and that political project isn't just in reference to a single criminal or mad personality, but has various ties to other countries and political movements besides Germany and Nazism. In that sense, regardless of the artistic judgment of it, The resistible rise of Arturo Ui by Bertolt Brecht is unconvincing. To illustrate Hitler's personality, he makes use of a literary genre which leads to misconceptions. It starts from a moral judgment, which is in fact constructed a posteriori. Nazism takes hold in a historical period in which the evidence in its favor consists of a racial hierarchy and a colonial expansion that often contains genocidal practices. Certainly, to inherit such a tradition at a time when it begins to be strongly challenged, and to radicalize it, going to the point of seeking to put it into action in Eastern Europe as well, is a terrible development of that tradition, but it's precisely a question of its development, not something created out of nothing. In 19th century culture, there's a widespread idea that racial extermination, Disraeli stresses, is the expression of an irresistible natural law. At the end of the century, Spencer laments that, we are entering into an era of social cannibalism, in which the strongest nations are devouring the weakest. In the United States between the 19th and 20th centuries, it's commonplace for there to be appeals for the final solution, and the complete and final solution to the respective indigenous and black questions. 552 Also around the same time in Canada, an authoritative government figure proposes the final solution to our indigenous question. 553 The horror and infamy of this radicalization remains the same, but it arises out of the experience of the failed attempt to build an overseas colonial empire, that at the outbreak of World War I is quickly eliminated by British naval superiority, which imposes on Germany a devastating and deadly naval blockade, even on the civilian population. Therefore they ask themselves, to continue being exposed to that terrible threat, or to build at all costs a continental empire, resorting to massacres and genocidal practices at the expense of the inferior races and following, at any rate, the classic and proven model of the West's colonial expansion? When it comes to the ruling ideology, any political project whatsoever disappears. The atrocities of the Third Reich are also expressions of a terrible madness of mysterious origins, but its name is nevertheless totalitarianism. That is how they set up the comparison of Stalin and Hitler. They even make the superfluous analogy between pan-Slavism and pan-Germanism, something that Arendt insisted upon, though today it doesn't appear to enjoy any noteworthy success. Everything revolves around the two personalities, on which they even sometimes trace biographical parallels. 554 What stands out the most in these writings is the absence of history, and even politics in a certain sense. Colonialism, imperialism, world wars, national liberation struggles, different and opposing political projects, they all disappear. Nor do they even ask about the relations of the liberal West with fascism and Nazism, and with the old Russian regime, whose contradictions have for a long time been moving towards the outbreak of an enormous catastrophe. Overall, all of this is left in the shadows due to the absolute centrality given to two creative personalities, albeit evil in their creativity.